The rain had been falling on Ashcombe for 3 days when Eleanor Whitmore signed away the last thing she thought she owned. She sat in the solicitor's office on Cheap Street with her hands folded in her lap, the way her mother had taught her to sit when she was a girl, and the world was watching. The window behind Mr. Paget's desk framed a gray sky the color of dishwater, and the radiator under it ticked and hissed without producing any warmth she could feel. On the desk between them lay a single sheet of paper, and beneath the paper lay the ruin of 11 years of marriage. "You understand," Mr. Paget said, not unkindly, "that by signing this you relinquish any claim to the property on Marlborough Terrace, the vehicles, and the joint accounts held at Lloyd's. Mr. Whitmore's counsel has been very clear on these points." "I understand," Eleanor said. She did not add that she had understood for far longer than Gerald imagined. She had understood the night she came home early from her shift at the surgery and found his coat hung on the hook that was hers, and beneath it, a pair of shoes that belonged to no one she wanted to name. She had understood in the months after, when the money in the joint account began moving in small, careful increments toward an account she was not meant to see. She had understood, and she had said nothing, because a woman who says nothing is a woman no one bothers to watch. "There's the matter of the property in Saltmarsh," Paget went on, shuffling to a second page as though it embarrassed him. The Grand Hotel, your late uncle's estate. Mr. Whitmore's solicitors have indicated he has no interest in contesting it." Eleanor looked up. "No interest?" "None whatsoever," Paget almost smiled. "I'm given to understand the building has been derelict for the better part of 2 decades. There are outstanding rates owed to the council, a structural survey from 2009 that reads rather like a death certificate, and a right-of-way dispute with the neighboring landowner that has never been resolved. Frankly, Mrs. Whitmore, it's a liability. Mr. Whitmore was quite happy to let you keep it." Of course he was. Gerald had never in his life kept a thing that could not be turned immediately into money or admiration. A crumbling hotel on a forgotten stretch of the Norfolk coast offered neither. He would have laughed about it to the woman with the nameless shoes. "She can have the wreck. It suits her." And the woman would have laughed too, and neither of them would have thought about it again. "I'll keep it," Eleanor said. Paget blinked. "You've seen it, then?" "Not in 30 years. She picked up the pen, but I remember it." She signed her name in the small, careful hand she had used since school, and with that signature Gerald Whitmore vanished from her life as thoroughly as if he had never entered it, taking the house and the cars and the good opinion of their mutual friends, and leaving her with a dead man's hotel and a daughter asleep in the car outside. What Gerald did not know, what the woman with the nameless shoes did not know, what Mr. Paget with his death certificate survey did not know, was that Eleanor Whitmore had not chosen the Grand Hotel by accident. She had been waiting 11 years for someone to hand it to her. The drive to Saltmarsh took 4 hours in the little Vauxhall that was, mercifully, in her name, and no one else's. Her daughter Nia slept against the window for the first 2, 12 years old and furious in the particular way of children who have been told very little and have guessed a great deal. When she woke, somewhere past King's Lynn, she looked out at the flat brown fields sliding past and said nothing for a long while. "Is it true we're poor now?" Nia said finally. "No," Eleanor said. "Bee at school said her mum said we lost everything." "Bee's mum," Eleanor said, "knows what she was told. That's not the same as knowing what's true." Nia turned this over. She had her mother's habit of turning things over rather than throwing them. "So what's true?" Eleanor watched the road. Ahead of them the land began to change, the fields giving way to reed beds and gray water, and a sky that opened up enormous over the coast, the way it had when she was a girl and her Uncle Thomas would drive her out to see the hotel he was so proud of. "What's true," she said, "is that people spent a long time deciding your mother wasn't worth very much. And your mother let them." "Why?" "Because," Eleanor said, It's easier to build something when nobody's watching you do it. The tide was going out when they reached Saltmarsh, and the whole village smelled of salt and wet stone and something older underneath, the mineral breath of a place that had been standing between the land and the sea for 1,000 years and expected to stand 1,000 more. Eleanor slowed the car as they came down the high street. She had prepared herself for change. 30 years is 30 years. But the village had contrived to change in the way seaside villages do, which is to say it had grown poorer and prouder at once. The butcher was gone. The little tearoom where her uncle used to buy her an iced bun was a charity shop now, its window full of other people's abandoned things. But the church still stood, and the harbor wall, and beyond the harbor, on the low rise where the land shouldered up against the sky, the Grand Hotel waited exactly where she had left it. Nia sat forward. That's it. That's it. It's huge. It was. 3 stories of pale Victorian brick, a wide double frontage with tall windows gone blind and gray, a portico that had once been white and was now the color of old teeth. Ivy had taken the east wing and was working patiently on the west. A board hung crooked over the entrance where the name had been, and someone long ago had boarded the ground floor windows, and someone more recent had prized half the boards away again, for reasons Eleanor could imagine and chose not to. She parked on the gravel that was more weed than gravel and switched off the engine, and for a moment neither of them moved. The building looked back at them the way an old dog looks at a returning owner it had stopped expecting. "Mum," Nia's voice had lost its edge, "are we going to live here?" For a while, Eleanor opened her door. "Come on, bring your coat." The front doors were locked, but Eleanor did not go to the front doors. She walked around the east side, past the drowned ivy and a fallen length of guttering, her shoes finding the old brick path by memory more than sight, until she came to a low door set into the wall beneath the level of the ground floor. A tradesman's door. A door no surveyor writing a death certificate would ever have bothered to note. From her coat pocket she took a key. It was old and black with age, and it had lived at the bottom of her jewelry box for 11 years, moved from house to flat to house, the one thing she had carried out of her old life that Gerald had never once asked about because he had never once imagined it mattered. Her Uncle Thomas had pressed it into her hand the last summer of his life, when she was 17 and he was dying, and everyone else had already begun dividing up what he would leave. "Not the deeds, Nell," he had said. "Any fool can inherit a building. I'm giving you the way in." She had not understood him then. She had spent 30 years understanding him. The key turned. The door gave with a groan, and cold air breathed out at them, dry and dusty, and Eleanor noted with a small private satisfaction, not damp. Not damp at all. "It smells weird," Nia said, following her in. "It smells dry," Eleanor said. "Remember that. It matters more than you know." They came up a flight of stone steps into what had been the servants' passage, and from there into the main body of the hotel, and there Nia stopped and simply stared, because, whatever a 12-year-old expects of a derelict building, it is not this. The lobby rose 2 full stories to a ceiling of molded plaster, cracked in places, water-stained in one corner, but intact. A staircase swept up from the center of the floor in a long, grand curve, its banister thick with dust but sound beneath it. Light came gray and dim through the tall boarded windows in blades and slivers, catching the dead chandelier overhead, and the reception desk of dark carved oak, and the black and white marble of the floor beneath 30 years of grit. It should have been sad. Eleanor knew it should have been sad. And to anyone else, to Gerald, to Paget, to the surveyor whose report she had read 4 times, it would have been nothing but sad, a monument to money spent and lost. Eleanor did not see it that way. She walked to the center of the marble floor, set down her bag, and turned slowly on her heel, reading the room the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, the way she had spent the better part of her adult life reading things that other people only glanced at. The cracks in the ceiling ran with the joists, not against them. Settlement, old and long since stopped, not structural failure. The water stain in the corner was a single stain, dark at the edges and pale at the center, an old leak, fixed or long dry, not an active one. The floor beneath her feet did not give. The stink of the place was dust and disuse, not the sweet rot of a building dying from the inside. The 2009 survey had called it a death certificate. Eleanor had read that survey the way she read everything, slowly and completely and twice, and she had noticed what Mr. Paget had not, what Gerald never would have, what the surveyor himself had perhaps not fully understood. The report condemned the fabric, the roof, the render, the rotten window frames, all the visible skin of the building. It said almost nothing about the bones. Because the man who wrote it had been paid to do a visual survey, and the bones of the Grand Hotel did not show. Eleanor knew about the bones. Her uncle had told her about the bones, the summer she was 17, in the long afternoons when the morphine made him talkative, and the rest of the family had grown bored of sitting with a dying man. "Nia," she said, "come here a moment, I want to show you something." Her daughter picked her way across the lobby. "Put your hand on this wall." Nia did. "It's cold." "What else?" "Dry." "Good girl. Now." Eleanor crouched beside the great staircase and brushed away 3 decades of dust from the base of the newel post until the wood showed through, dark and close-grained and hard as iron. "Your great-great-grandfather built this hotel in 1887. Do you know what most men built with in 1887 when they were building to impress?" Nia shook her head. "Whatever was cheapest that looked expensive. Soft stone, green timber, render over rubble." Eleanor ran her thumb along the grain. "This man didn't. He was a shipwright before he was a hotelier, and he built this place the way he'd built boats to stand against the sea for 100 years. Oak frame, proper foundations dug down to the clay, a slate roof under the render, not just on top of it." She stood, brushing off her hands. "Everyone who's ever looked at this building has seen a ruin. They see the skin. They've never once thought to ask about the bones." Nia looked up at the vast, dim room with new eyes, not a child's eyes now, but something closer to her mother's. "So it's not falling down." "It's the soundest building in this village," Eleanor said quietly. "And it has been this whole time, while everyone agreed it was worthless, including the people who could have had it for the cost of the back rates." She picked up her bag. "That's the first thing I want you to understand about the world, Nia. The value of a thing and what people say it's worth are almost never the same number, and the space between those two numbers," she started up the grand staircase, her hand light on the dusty rail, "is where clever people make their whole lives. Word of a newcomer travels faster than any other kind of news in a place like Saltmarsh, and by the following morning it had reached everyone who mattered and a good many who didn't." Eleanor learned this when she walked down to the village at 8:30 to find something for breakfast and discovered that the small shop by the harbor, the only one still selling food, went quiet the moment she stepped through the door. Not silent, quiet. The particular hush of people who had been talking about you deciding at once to talk about something else. She bought bread, eggs, milk, a bag of apples and tea, and set them on the counter. The woman behind it was perhaps 60, broad and capable-looking, with a face that had spent a lifetime deciding quickly about people and rarely revising the decision. "You'll be the one taken on the Grand," the woman said. It was not a question. "I will." Thomas Ashworth's niece. His great-niece. Eleanor counted out coins. "You knew him." Everyone knew Thomas. The woman rang up the shopping with the air of someone doing a favor she'd regret. Knew him well enough to know he'd not thank anyone for buying that place. Money pit that. Broke his heart and near enough broke him too before the end. "You want my advice?" She pushed the bag across. "You'll board it back up and sell the land to Crane and go home to wherever you came from." "Crane," Eleanor repeated. "Douglas Crane." The name came out flat and careful, the way people say a name they've learned to be careful with. Owns near enough everything worth owning between here and Wells. The marina, the new builds up past the church, half the harbor front. She nodded out the window toward a low glass-fronted building at the water's edge that was newer and shinier than anything else in the village. He's been after that hilltop 20 years, wants to knock the old wreck down and put up flats, sea views, weekenders. Her mouth tightened on the word the way a Norfolk woman's mouth tightens on very little else. He'll offer you a fair price. Take it. That's kind advice, Eleanor said, and meant it, because she could hear that the woman thought it was. Might I ask your name? Marjorie Selwyn. Eleanor Whitmore. She lifted the bag. I don't think I'll be selling, Mrs. Selwyn. But thank you. She was at the door when Marjorie Selwyn spoke again, and this time the flatness had gone out of her voice and left something more careful underneath. He won't like that, she said. Crane, he's not a man who likes being told no by. She stopped. By a woman, Eleanor finished for her without heat. No, I don't imagine he is. She let the door close on the shop's returned silence and walked back up the hill with her breakfast. And if her step was a little lighter than it had been, no one saw it but the gulls. She had wondered, on the long drive from Ashcombe, whether anyone would want the hotel, whether her whole quiet calculation might founder on the simple fact that a worthless building in a dying village was worthless to everyone alike. Marjorie Selwyn had just answered the question for her, without meaning to. Someone wanted it very much. That changed everything. A thing nobody wants is a burden. A thing one powerful man wants and has wanted for 20 years and cannot have, that is not a burden at all. That is leverage. Douglas Crane did not come himself. Men like Crane rarely came themselves. That was one of the things Eleanor had learned in 11 years of watching Gerald and Gerald's friends, the men who ran the golf club and the practices and the little empires of their little town. Power announced itself first through intermediaries, so that if the intermediary was refused, no one important had been seen to be refused. The intermediary arrived on the third day, in a car too clean for the coast, and knocked at the front doors, which meant he had not thought to wonder how she was getting in and out, which told Eleanor something about how carefully these people were actually looking at her. She let him wait a moment, then opened one heavy door and stood in the gap. He was young, well-dressed, with the smooth, apologetic manner of a man whose whole job was to be liked right up, until the moment it was his job to be something else. Mrs. Whitmore, Simon Hale, I'm with Crane Coastal. I hope I'm not disturbing you. He had a leather folder under his arm and a smile ready-made. Mr. Crane asked me to pop by and welcome you to Saltmarsh. And to see whether we mightn't be able to take a considerable headache off your hands. How considerate of him, Eleanor said. Do come in, mind the step, the light's poor. She watched him take in the lobby as he entered, and she watched him fail to see it. His eyes went to the water stain, the cracked plaster, the boarded windows, the dust, and she could see him totting up dilapidation like a man reading a menu, pleased with every fault because every fault was a reason the price should be low. He did not look at the staircase. He did not touch the walls. He would have made, she thought, a very poor surgeon. Golly, he said, with the comfortable contempt of a man who already believed he'd won. It's worse than the photographs, isn't it? You know, Mrs. Whitmore, I have to be honest with you, most people in your position would just want rid. The rates alone. He winced theatrically. And a structural survey that I gather was really quite alarming. Mr. Crane's prepared to be very generous given all that. Take the whole problem away. Cash, quick completion, no chain. He opened the folder and turned it toward her, and there was a number on the page, and it was, she had to admit, not a small number, to a woman who was supposed to have just lost everything. Eleanor looked at it for exactly as long as courtesy required. That's a great deal of money, she said, for a worthless building. Simon Hale's smile did not change, but something behind it did, a small hitch quickly covered. Well, it's the land, really. The building itself we'd be clearing, of course. Of course, She smiled at him warmly and handed the folder back. "Do thank Mr. Crane for me. It's such a comfort to know the place is wanted, but I'm afraid it's not for sale." "Mrs. Whitmore," the smile was working harder now, "I don't think you quite appreciate the position you're in. The rate's arrears alone come to £11,420, Eleanor said, "as of the last demand, plus interest accruing at the statutory rate. I've written to the council. There's a hardship provision for inherited derelict properties that suspends enforcement for 12 months while a restoration plan is prepared. I filed the plan on Monday." She let that sit for a moment in his suddenly attentive face. "Was there anything else, Mr. Hale?" There was not. He gathered himself and his folder and his cooling smile and made his way back out to his too-clean car, and Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched him go, and thought about the number on the page, not because she was tempted by it, but because of what it told her. Douglas Crane had offered a great deal of money, sight unseen, through a man who'd never touched the walls, for a building he intended to knock down. You do not pay that much to demolish something worthless. Which meant Douglas Crane, like Eleanor, knew about the bones, or knew about something, and whatever it was he had been counting for 20 patient years, on no one else ever finding out. She closed the great door and stood a moment in the dim, dusty grandeur of her uncle's hotel, and for the first time since she had signed her old life away in Mr. Paget's office, Eleanor Whitmore allowed herself to smile properly. The game had a second player now, and the second player had just shown her his hand without ever meaning to. The question of what Douglas Crane knew kept Eleanor awake that night, in the small dry room on the first floor that she had chosen for herself because it faced the sea. She lay listening to the building settle around her, the honest tick and creak of old timber cooling, none of the wet groaning that would have meant trouble, and she turned the question over the way she turned everything over, patiently, from every side. A man does not spend 20 years wanting a hilltop for the view. Views are common on the Norfolk coast. Crane owned a marina full of them. He did not want to knock the hotel down because it was ugly or because it was in his way. He wanted the ground it stood on, specifically, and he wanted it enough to overpay for it sight unseen, and he had been patient about it for 2 decades, which meant whatever was under that ground was not going anywhere, and he knew it. In the morning she began, as she began everything, by reading. Her uncle's papers had come to her along with the key, 3 tea chests of them, mildewed and disordered, that she had carried out of the family clearance 30 years ago and stored ever since in the roof of every house she had lived in. Another thing Gerald had never asked about. She had brought them all. Now she carried them down to the great dining room, set them on the one table she had cleaned, and began, box by box and page by page, to read her way into a dead man's mind. It took 4 days. Nia helped when she was not exploring, and she explored constantly now, the fear gone out of her, replaced by the fierce proprietary joy of a child who has been given a castle. She catalogued rooms. She found a nest of jackdaws in a 3rd-floor chimney and named all of them. She reported each evening on her discoveries, and Eleanor listened to every word, because a child who is truly looking at a place will always see things the adults miss, and more than once Nia's chatter turned out to matter. But it was Eleanor, on the 4th day, who found it. Not a treasure, not a secret room, something better and far more dangerous. A letter and a map and a survey, a real one, a proper geological survey, commissioned by her Uncle Thomas in the spring of 1971. When he had been, the papers showed, briefly and privately, very frightened. The letter was from a firm of hydrologists in Norwich. The language was dry and technical, and Eleanor read it 3 times to be sure she understood it. And then she sat very still in the cold dining room with the sea muttering beyond the boarded windows, and understood it completely. The Grand Hotel did not stand on ordinary ground. It stood on the head of an aquifer, a vast natural reservoir of fresh water held in the chalk beneath the coast, sealed under a cap of clay, fed from the high ground inland and finding its way, over unhurried geological time, toward the sea. The survey her uncle had commissioned mapped it, and it identified, directly beneath the hotel's foundations, the one place along this whole stretch of coast where the clay cap thinned and the aquifer rose close enough to the surface to be reached. Her uncle had commissioned the survey because he was afraid the water would undermine his building. The hydrologists had reassured him. The clay was stable, the flow was slow, the hotel was safe. He had filed the papers away relieved and never thought about them again, and the great fact sitting inside them, the fact that would have meant nothing at all in 1971, had waited 50 years in a tea chest for someone to read it who understood what it was now worth. Eleanor understood. She had not spent 11 years as a doctor's wife without learning what her husband's practice was really made of, and she had not spent the 4 years before that doing the thing she never spoke of, the thing that was the real reason a woman like her could read a geological survey and a rates demand, and a structural report with equal ease. But even without any of that, the arithmetic here was not hard. Fresh water, clean, deep, chalk-filtered fresh water, in a region where every summer the papers filled with warnings of drought, where the water companies were under orders to find new supply, where a single licensed borehole into a proven aquifer was worth. She did the sum slowly, and then again to be sure, not a great deal of money. A fortune. And it could only be reached from one place. This hilltop. This ground. The ground beneath the worthless hotel that Gerald had laughed about giving away, that Marjorie Selwyn had advised her to sell, that Douglas Crane had been trying to buy for 20 years so that he could knock the building down and sink his own borehole into the chalk and sell the water back to the county for the rest of his life. That was what he knew. That was what he had always known. Somewhere through a friend at the water board, an old survey of his own, a leaked report, Douglas Crane had learned what lay under the hill, and he had understood that the only obstacle between himself and a river of money was a derelict building he couldn't legally demolish because he didn't own it, and an old dying man's key that had ended up, by an accident he could never have predicted, in the hands of a woman everyone had agreed to overlook. Eleanor set down the survey. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. "Nia," she called, and her voice carried up through the empty grand rooms of the hotel that was, she now understood, one of the most valuable half-acres in the east of England. "Come down, would you? I need to show you what a person looks like when they've just been given the whole game and don't know it yet." Her daughter appeared at the top of the great staircase, jackdaw feather behind one ear, and looked down at her mother sitting small and straight and smiling at a table full of a dead man's papers. "You found something," Nia said. "I found everything," Eleanor said. "Now I have to be very, very careful, because a man who's waited 20 years for a thing is a patient man, and patient men are the ones you have to watch."